The advice you've been given about relationships and boundaries is keeping you stuck in dysfunctional and unsatisfying dynamics. Because what most people are taught is this: state your needs and cut off anybody who doesn't meet them. And at first glance, that sounds empowering, but placing all of the work on the other person is not boundaries, it's a subtle form of control. And most people who are doing it have absolutely no idea. Boundaries are not words and they're not actions either, they are signals. And if your signal is not coherent, if some part of you doesn't believe that you deserve the space that you are claiming that you want, the other person will not hear the words, they will not see the actions, they will feel the incoherence of your signal. They are responding to what your body is saying, not just your words. Relational dynamics used to terrify me, and I was stuck in patterns of dysfunctional relationships, romantically, platonically, in my family. And this framework is not something that I just help my clients with. It's something that's also allowed me to transform my now 9-year partnership, romantic partnership, and many other relationships in my life. So, in this video, we're going to talk about why having that boundary conversation is actually the last step, not the first. If you can actually show up in the relationship in a way that you claim you want to show up in it as, and how to build this signal coherence that allows us to set our boundaries in a really meaningful way. Now, before we go any further, I need to say this. If you are in an abusive or coercive dynamic, no amount of embodiment and nervous system work will help you connect in a safe way. This is for relationships that have the capacity to become safe and connected, but have defaulted to self abandonment. Whether or not your relationships transform, because there are two of you in here, is not just reliant on the fact that you're doing this work, but also on the other person's capacity to evolve. So when you start implementing this, not all relationships will stay, but it doesn't really matter because this is about learning how to connect with yourself. If you do not know how to connect with yourself in a meaningful way, all of the other relational dynamics in your life, including your relationship to life, creativity, work, money, amongst everything else, like relationships with another person, they're going to still suffer. Most people in relationships do one of two things. They will either go silent about their needs or they will exclaim them as rules to be followed. And what we often do is we oscillate between the two. But both of those things keep us in duality of the relationship, duality of understanding. And as we will talk about later, signal coherence means that you have to build the capacity to move out of a state of collapsing when there is a duality situation or options presented to you. If you don't do the inner work to make that signal coherent, you will boundary yourself into oblivion with less connection than you started out with, which is the opposite of what boundaries are meant to do. Boundaries are here to protect sanctity of relationships. They are here to make us feel more connected in a way that doesn't require the self-abandonment. So if you find yourself again and again feeling more and more lonely every single time there is a boundary statement said, there might be something happening beneath the surface. My point here is not do not talk about your needs, and is also not do not ask for things. However, my points are relational dynamics are co-created often through unconscious roles, and setting boundaries that we haven't inhabited yet through embodiment often fail because the nervous system and the subconscious, which work in tandem, are often broadcasting a completely different message than your words and actions are. So I want to talk about the 3 steps of how to actually do this, but I also just want to name, before we go into this, a little bit about those unconscious roles that we play. I practice and study depth psychology. And we often talk about shadow work and projections that happen in relationships, but we don't often talk about is there are actually multiple types of projections and they require different work. And I plan on talking about this deeper in a different video. But a lot of these control patterns that we have are very, very unconscious, and it's easier for outside people to see them much more than you seeing it for yourself because our unconscious is naturally a place that we do not see consciously. So having somebody reflect these back to you can be really, really helpful. I noticed this not just in my clients, but I started noticing it in my own life. I was working with a therapist. I was following therapists online. I was taking courses. I was in all the forums with me and my partner, setting all of the boundaries, not over functioning, doing all the things that everyone said to do. But underneath that, there was a belief that he needed to be different. And when we move in a relationship with that belief, all of these very subtle control mechanisms come into play, and boundaries can be a great place where our need for control can hide. That's why the first step here of how to handle this without just having a boundary conversation is self-inquiry. Now, you probably do a lot of self-inquiry. This type of self-inquiry requires a little bit of not just shadow work, because once again, there are different types of relationships and they require different types of projection work. Doing that inner work of asking yourself, are you projecting what is actually yours to embody onto the other person? And or are you playing a role in the relationship that quietly serves you? Or are you actually showing up in a way that you want in this relationship? I'm going to give an example later that might make this more concrete for you. I'm going to talk about my own experience with this in one way, because as I said, relational dynamics have not been easy for me in my life. This is very hard-earned wisdom here. A lot of us think we want certain things in relationships, but we don't actually believe that we deserve them. And this is going to make that signal coherence difficult because before the actions, before the thoughts, before the feelings, there are much deeper stories at play involving not just mental stories, but stories that have been built again and again and again and reinforced in the nervous system. There are sensations, there are somatic signals that have been reinforced over time. So before you have an idea of what that story is, you've already reacted. This is why so much of somatic work and how I do it is not just about releasing energy, it's about slowing down. A lot of the people I work with, they are givers, they are over functioners. And what often happens is we find safety in that place because it is difficult for us to learn how to receive love and attention. And so we often say, I don't want to continue being the giver, but we also believe that we are not worthy outside of being the giver. This creates a lot of cognitive dissonance and a lot of dissonance in the system that creates a lot of tension, which is why a lot of us are having autoimmune disorders. As many of you guys know, I have a past history of autoimmune disorders, past history of chronic pain, extreme anxiety, all of these things. And a lot of this was because of so much of this tension in relational dynamics that was once again coming up in so many different aspects of my life. Now, how do we move from the self-inquiry into the second step? The second step is small experiments. Instead of just having a conversation about your needs, try taking up space more. A small experiment can look like if you believe that you were always the one giving, 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 and you were always listening as I was in my relationships, it can look like saying, hey, I have something I want to say today. I want to share with you today. I love that you're sharing that with me, but today I'd actually like to talk about something that's been going on in my life. And this is not to test the other person. This is to test yourself. Can you actually show up in the way that you claim you want to be in relationships? Because here's the thing. When you start doing this and you start seeing, how does my body respond when I actually take up space in a relationship? How does it feel in my body? What happens? What sensations arise in my body? When you are waiting to have a boundary conversation or waiting for somebody else to change, you are unconsciously asking them for permission to show up in a certain way. And that is not embodied leadership. In order for you to give a signal that is coherent, you do not need to ask for permission or somebody else to allow you to take up space. Now, third, you assess the data. With most relationships, doing this once is not going to be enough. Doing this twice might not be enough either. You might have to do it several times and gather multiple pieces of data of, did this person adapt? Did this person allow me to take up space? Did the relationship shift? And now, if necessary, you can have the boundary conversation in a really embodied way, because you know that you have actually tried to take up that space. And once again, a lot of this depends on the other person's capacity to evolve. You cannot control that, but you can control how you are responding within that relational dynamic. Regardless of if the relationship stays or goes, you are learning how to build genuine connection within yourself. These patterns of self-abandonment are affecting every single part of your life. I work with a lot of creative and service-oriented entrepreneurs, and these are the reasons why a lot of them over-explain or don't even show up because they're afraid of being misunderstood. This is why a lot of people overwork and undercharge because they don't want to disappoint other people. And then they're confused about why they're doing everything right, but they're still feeling so dissatisfied in the relationship. The nervous system patterns don't disappear when we start building our lives, right? They amplify, actually. I often say having a business is the most spiritual practice because of the amplification of these patterns. I want to just give an example of how this showed up in my own life. I mean, this happened in so many ways in my life. I was always the counselor. I was always the person who was giving advice. I was always the mediator growing up. And I felt like everyone just wanted me around for my ability to give advice, to give attention, to give presence. I realized after a lot of self-inquiry that that was actually what I wanted too. Because a part of me believed that if I didn't give them those things, I had no value, I had no worth. And so they would leave. And being abandoned and rejected was not going to work for me. So I was unconsciously maintaining these dynamics in order to keep myself safe. As human beings, we understand from a very early age, I mean, infant, pre-verbal, that connection equals safety. Connection is a fundamental human need. It is not a want. We need it like we need food and water. And we understand that from a very early age. So the idea of people leaving us or rejecting us is very primitive. So we will maintain horrible conditions in order to have those situations until one day we hit a breaking point and we get really real about what we need to do. Instead of sitting everybody down in my life and saying, okay, I'm no longer going to be doing this. I need to have more space. I'm no longer going to be doing this. I just stopped. When people came to me and asked for advice, I just said, I'm really sorry you're going through that. And I meant it. And what I realized was shocking. Most people completely allowed it. Most people made room for me. It had never been a reality that my value and my worth were tied to the advice I gave. That was a story that I had created a long time ago, a survival pattern that I had outgrown a long time ago, but my system was holding onto it for safety. Most people had no idea that I didn't want to show up that way. How would they have? They thought that I just liked giving advice. Yet I had made them a villain in the story and made myself the victim. There was just a misappropriation of energy. And once I rearranged that energy within my own body, I found joy in service. Again, I found joy in offering advice and offering wisdom because it was a choice now. And I actually created a business around it. I always say I deeply believe that I for myself, I had to understand these things before I started being of service. Because what I want to build in my work is trust, longevity, knowing and understanding these dynamics before even stepping into my role was incredibly helpful for me. Learning how to maintain energetic sovereignty. Now, I want to just make sure you know that relationships are messy. I'm in no way sitting here saying, oh, my relationships are just great now. I'm just like perfect and life is so good. Human beings on their own are incredibly complex. You add a second person into that, and it's like, yeah, it's going to be messy and it's going to be a forever, ever learning process. There is no perfection in relationships, but we can have deeper connection. And that's what it's really all about. Now, one of the biggest questions I can see here is how do we gain that internal coherence? And that may be a place to go deeper in another video. This internal coherence comes through building capacity in the nervous system. Capacity is what allows us to heal. And in relational dynamics, this looks like being able to hold two opposing thoughts, ideas, truths without collapsing into one of them. A duality that can often come into this part of our lives is I'm not getting my needs met, and this person is really trying their best based on the knowledge they have. And we often oscillate between the two, right? Well, I don't need to really talk about my needs because this person is really doing the best they can and they made improvements. Or we go into the other, collapse into the other and forget that this person is a whole person. They have no idea what's maybe happening. And we just say, I'm not getting my needs met. Most of us have not learned how to build nervous system capacity to be able to hold two ideas at once without collapsing into the other. And this shows up in Jungian psychology as a transcendent function. This shows up in fascia as well. Ultimately, human beings do not know how to sit in uncertainty, and we will do so many things in order to avoid sitting in that uncertainty. I mean, I created a whole group program around this called Inner Revolution Immersion for people that are on these identity thresholds or that are wanting to learn how to build this capacity. So this is the type of work that I do in my one-on-one work, in my group programs, in my workshops. Right now I have some wait lists for Inner Revolution, for creative rewilding, for my one-on-one sessions. If you're wanting to do this work with me, I'm excited to talk more about the different types of projections and more about building capacity in order to be able to regain energetic sovereignty, not just in our relationships, but in our entire life, and move toward deeper connection with everything that we bring into our lives. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.